Hello. In the 17th century, the Czech educator Comenius had a simple but momentous plan to address the deep antipathies behind the wars that were devastating Europe. That plan was universal education. Everyone would learn about everything and therefore better understand one another and so tolerate their religious differences. His ideas have had a lasting influence on education right up to the present day. So who better to discuss Comenius with me than our own education officer, John Denning. John, the BBC have just done a programme on the life and influence of Comenius, but I dare say that he's not well known to most people. But rather than start with his background and his early life, I want to go sort of straight to the key question, which is, why should we be interested in Comenius, and what is his significance for Christians today?
Well, he's had an enormous impact on education today. So almost everywhere you look in the world, the way the education system is set up, the way the schools work, the way the curriculum works, the way textbooks are written, they all reflect the ideas that Comenius had hundreds of years ago. But those ideas spring from Comenius's Christian beliefs. Absolutely, they're founded on Christ. That's where these ideas come from that have then gone on to be reflected in education systems all over the world. So it's a huge encouragement and inspiration, I think, to Christians who are interested in education or in working in education.
Just explain this point a little bit more. How did his Christian faith connect to his ideas on education and the significance that he placed upon those ideas?
Well, he was born in 1592, so a few generations into the Reformation, although in fact he was a Hussite, he was a Moravian Hussite, so he was part of a group that dated back before Luther, so they were Protestant before there were any Protestants. But he tremendously valued the Reformation. He worked with other groups. I mean, he had contact with Calvinists and Lutherans as well. So he tremendously valued that. But he thought that the Reformation needed to work out further beyond the church, and he wanted to see a reformation of politics, to change the way that people related to one another in the political sphere. He also thought the Reformation should extend to education, reform education, and reform the way that people thought about the natural world as well, and he wanted to look at the relationship between people and the natural world. And he was really full of joy, really, by the natural world. He really valued God's creation, and he wanted to move education away from simply being about, well, you learn your Latin, your Greek or whatever, and then you learn to engage in debate and discussion, and it all being just about words. Not that he was dismissing that, but he had a great emphasis on the natural world, the physical world, the actual things of the world that were there as part of God's creation, and saw that by learning about that, contemplating those things, that could have a real transformative effect, and that was then reflected in some of the textbooks that he wrote. We'll look at an example of that perhaps later.
So at the Christian Institute, we talk about how our Christian faith affects every area of life. We talk about the need for Christians to be salt and light in society. We talk about the significance of common grace. It sounds to me that Comenius was very strong on all of these ideas. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, he saw Christ as being at the centre of everything. He wrote a book towards the end of his life about the one thing necessary, and that was recognising the lordship of Christ as the answer to all sorts of perplexities in life. So he saw Christ being the centre of everything. But he saw education as being a means of bringing that light to all. And he also saw education as having that effect of a preservative on society. By people being educated. He saw that as being the salt aspect, really, particularly in relation to the conflicts that were going on in Europe throughout most of his life.
Yeah, that's important because we said that his desire to bring about universal education was essentially driven, at least in part, by the the clashes that were affecting Europe as he saw around it. And he also was operating in this time of war. He was operating in a time of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. To what extent did those two things shape his life and shape how his ideas were formed?
Well, his ideas were formed in the middle of all that, really. He had a very, very hard life. He was a refugee for most of his life. He had to leave Moravia, the Czech Republic, as it is now. He lived in Sweden, he lived in Poland, he lived in the Netherlands. He came to London at one point, but he managed to arrive just before the Civil War broke out here. So he had a very difficult time. And through all those moves, his manuscripts would get lost. He would lose his library. I think at one point they were burnt. And if in those days, if you lost your manuscript that you're working on, you just had to start from the beginning all over again. Yeah. So he had that experience. His first wife and children died of plague just 4 years, I think it was, into their marriage. So he had these tremendous adversity throughout his life, tremendous discouragements in that work, that he'd done all the work and then he had to start all over again. And yet he persevered. I think that's, for Christians who maybe feel that life in education now isn't that easy as a Christian, well, he certainly experienced that to a great extent, and yet the Lord really blessed his work and brought great fruit from it.
Now, I said he's possibly not terribly well known, but what would you say are the things that made up his life that he's most well known for? You talked about some of the books he'd written and so on. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so he believed in what he called pansophia, universal wisdom applied to all areas of life, and he wanted education to cover all those areas. So he had this very, very broad view of education.
That sounds very connected to common grace.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's recognizing that all things are made by God, that he is gracious to all people in what he provides throughout his creation. That inspired him, I'm sure. That was an element in wanting to have this broad education. He also wanted that education to be for all people, and he really meant all people. So, going right back to the very first schools in Britain, they were founded by Christians. But really, Comenius is the first person to be really explicit and that education should be for absolutely everyone. So he said, not the children of the rich or of the powerful only, but of all alike, boys and girls, both noble and ignoble, rich and poor, in all cities and towns, villages and hamlets should be sent to school. So it is this very, very broad idea that everybody should be provided with this education. And it was education that would go all the way through as well. So he had a number of levels of school that he came up with. So nursery schools, primary schools, secondary schools, college and university.
Sounds very familiar.
It does, doesn't it? He didn't stop there. He wasn't saying they should all be sent away from the home to school and parents should have nothing to do with it. He talked about the school of the mother. And he wrote a book to equip mothers in particular to start that education in the home even before the nursery school. He encouraged them, to take the child out at night and point out the stars and the moon. And he saw that as being the first step. And then he had this idea of what we'd now call a spiral curriculum, where there's a topic and you do it at a basic level at one stage, you revisit it again, build on those foundations and do it at a more complex level at the next stage, and building up education in that way.
So he really was quite ahead of his time.
He really was, yes, and textbooks as well. Printing press had been around for a while by then, but he was the first to really see its potential for use in education. So he produced textbooks. At the time, you might have expected them to be produced in Latin. That was the language of education across Europe. But he produced them in Latin and in English or Czech or whatever the vernacular was. And then he went a stage further and thought, well, actually, that would help with learning the Latin, but it would also help with learning the English. So he put in pictures as well. So he came up with these textbooks that were really encyclopedias of everything. But unlike an encyclopedia that's typically nowadays arranged alphabetically, he arranged them topically. So he would start with God, and then he'd move on to the world and humans, and then he'd take it different aspects of the world, like plants or whatever. He'd have a drawing, then he'd have numbers on the drawing, and then a key in English and in Latin, and then he'd have subsequent textbooks that went into greater depth. And these were tremendously popular, and they sold all over Europe. And apparently, it's quite difficult to find very many good copies of them now because lots were printed, but then they were used because people loved them so much, and so they got tattered and ripped and not preserved that well. But there are still some copies.
So how come he isn't better known?
I think there's a complicated story about that's connected to what happened towards the end of his life and sort of shifts in academic culture there. But he is known in some places. There's an annual Comenius medal awarded by the United Nations. The European Union has some Comenius prize, I think, for a school annually. He appears on a banknote in the Czech Republic. So there are people who know about him and who celebrate him, but perhaps Christians need to reclaim him and learn from him.
But there was a gap, wasn't there, between him putting forward all these ideas and then them perhaps being more universally adopted?
Yeah. So I think his ideas were, they were undoubtedly very radical for the time. Perhaps too advanced for governments to really grab hold of at the time, and so they were forgotten about to some extent, and then really rediscovered in the 19th and 20th centuries. Of course, in Britain in the 1830s, particularly, there was a massive program of the church being involved in founding schools.
Christians in education again,
yeah, Christians in education again, trying to provide, particularly for the urban poor at the time of the Industrial Revolution. But that was drawing on some ideas from Comenius.
So how would you sum up his legacy to us today?
I think his legacy is obvious in the education systems that we see, but I think the legacy that we need to really grab hold of as Christians is his vision for the glory of God that's to be seen in the creation, for the great value that then gives to learning about those things and to education, for the real blessing that can be on society as a whole when Christians in particular get involved in putting that vision into action.
That's a great place to finish. Thanks very much, John.